machine learning and has authored more than 225 publications and 2 books. His current research topics include robust artificial intelligence, robust human AI systems, and applications in sustainability. Yeah, thank you very much for coming, and yeah, take it away, Thomas.
Okay, I think I got rid of the weird sharing window that popped up. So it's exciting to have this opportunity to talk in this series on anomaly detection for scientific discovery. I'm really looking forward to the whole series of lectures. This is joint work with several graduate students: Andrew Emmett, Stiliu, Rishit Garapalli, Alex Geyer, and Dan Hendricks, who was actually was an undergraduate intern with me, and then 2 of my fellow faculty members, Alan Fern and Debashis Mondal. But I also want to thank Dan Hendricks and Balaji Lakshmanarayanan, who gave me advice and suggestions about, from their perspective on the space of anomaly detection methods. So I first got interested in the problem of open category detection back in the mid-2000s when I was working on a project on the automated counting of freshwater macroinvertebrates, which means bugs that live in streams. So the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency every year does a random sampling of the freshwater streams and rivers in the United States, and they send out technicians that use a kick net like this. So they're kicking the sort of substrate of the river into this net, and the water's flowing downstream left to right there in the image. And so they take this sample back to the lab and separate out the insects from the pebbles and the leaves and so on. And then a taxonomist identifies each insect to at least the genus level and often to species level. And they count those up, and that gives them a sort of histogram that's kind of a spectrum for what pollution has been in the stream over time, and so on. So it's a bioindicator. But of course, this relies on a scarce resource, which is insect taxonomists. And so we had the idea, could we use computer vision to automate the identification and counting of the insects? And we also were ambitious and wanted to build a robotic apparatus so you could take the sample, dump it into the machine, and it would separate out the insects and photograph them and sort them. So my collaborators collected 100 specimens from each of 54 classes of interest. And this was in the pre-deep learning days, but we were using things like histograms of gradients and SIFT features and so on to classify these. And we had a classifier that was about 90% correct on the 54 classes. So we were very happy with that until our collaborators pointed out that there are actually 76,000 species of freshwater insects worldwide and more than 1,200 in the US. And in addition, field samples would contain other things like leaves and trash. And so we really had an open category problem that not only would there be the 54 species of interest, and we have beautiful photos of our specimens, right? Those are very nice, but there'd be all these other species and things there. And we estimated that our equal error rate when there was novel stuff in the data was about 20%. So 20% false alarm rate and 20% missed alarm, if we think of an alarm as being detecting something is novel. So that's what motivated me to look at the open category problem. But of course, this problem, it also goes by the name open set or out of distribution detection. Obviously, this arises in any application that needs to operate in an open world. So it could be novel obstacles in self-driving cars, novel diseases in medical imaging, novel products in online marketplaces, novel cyber attacks in cybersecurity. And so I would like to see that every deployed machine learning classifier should include a competence model that can detect when new queries that it's getting, new images in my case, are far from the training data, and therefore the trained classifier is not competent to classify them. So the model that we've been pursuing is basically we take our training data and we train both the classifier and a competence model, which in our case is going to be an anomaly detector. And given a query input, we'll ask, well, what is the estimated competence of the classifier on this query? And if it's big enough, then we go ahead and use the classifier, but otherwise we'll reject the specimen. And so at one level, this looks like classification with a reject option. But classification with a reject option, which is a topic that's been studied for decades. I think Chow had a paper on it around 1970 or something. That's looking at the risk of misclassification near the decision boundary. So it assumes that the classifier, that it's a closed world, whereas our problem here is that it's an open world, and we'll see that produces a lot of additional challenges. So there are two problem formulations that have been studied more in the deep learning literature: the so-called OOD setting and the open category setting. And they're essentially the same except for how we generate the test data. So the idea is we're given training data, which consists of image and class label pairs, right? And we'll say that they are drawn from a distribution D0, and there are K class labels. And then our test data is going to be some sort of mixture distribution that is a mixture of data from D0 and from a second distribution called the anomaly distribution, or the alien distribution. And we want to, and so in the OOD setting, the aliens are drawn from a different data set. So we might train, for instance, on MNIST digits, and then test on a mix of MNIST and Street View house numbers. So the class labels could be the same, but it could be a different data set. Or we might train on, test on something completely different, right? Insects or something. And then, whereas in the open set problem, what we do is we take a supervised training set that had, say, N plus M classes, and we hold out some fraction of the classes as to be our novel classes. And so we train on a subset of the classes, which are the known classes, but at test time, we're getting data from all the classes. And our problem is to detect those. But otherwise, the goal is the same, the metrics are the same, and the algorithms generally are the same. So the metrics that we typically measure in these things are the area under the ROC curve, treating this as a binary decision. Given a query, does it belong to data from domain A versus domain B in the case of out of distribution, or is it from a known class or a novel class in the novel category, open category setting? And I'm going to refer to like true positive rate and true negative rate. I treat the aliens or the anomalies as being the positive class. The literature isn't consistent on that either. So, but this is the way I'm stuck with it in my brain. So, I think AUROC is useful as an overall index of algorithm quality, but in real applications, we're usually interested in controlling our errors in one of two tails of the distribution. So one is we might want to maximize our rate of detecting the anomalies for a fixed false alarm rate. So we might say that we want to maximize our true positives, ability to detect the anomalies, but ensuring that we have no more than 10% false positive rate. Because in anomaly detection, we often find that we have a very high false alarm rate or false positive rate. And this can be very bad. And in things like financial fraud, where you don't have enough people to actually look at all the alarms, you want to restrict them to make sure that the alarms you do give have high precision, and even if you're not finding them all. But in AI safety and trustworthy systems kinds of applications, the situation is reversed. We want to make sure that we find, say, 95% of all of the aliens, all of the cyber attacks, say, and then minimize our false positive rate or our false alarm rate subject to that constraint. So we want high recall of the anomalies. Okay, well, the plan for the talk is, I figured since this was one of the early talks in this series, that I would have a bit of a tutorial. And so I'll begin by reviewing theoretical approaches to anomaly detection, focusing mostly on feature vector data. And then we'll look at attempts to apply those same methods in deep anomaly detection for computer vision, specifically for object classification. And one thing we're going to find there is a surprise, which is that the state of the art is basically achieved by not using any of the standard approaches to anomaly detection, but instead by using the maximum of the logit scores of a supervised classifier. And so the last part of the talk will be, I'll put forth a hypothesis about why that's true and present some supporting evidence. Okay, so I think there are four main families of methods in standard anomaly detection. The first are distance-based methods, then there are density estimation techniques, quantile methods, and reconstruction methods. And so let me give examples of each of those. So in distance-based methods are absolutely the simplest thing. We assume we have some way of measuring distances between two instances. It might be Euclidean distance or some weighted Euclidean distance. And given a query, if this is a bunch of our training data, given a query, if the distance to, say, the three nearest neighbors is large, then we would rate this as an outlier and therefore as an anomaly. Whereas if the query is in here and the distances are very small, we would say, no, that's not an anomaly. So I should point out that the assumption here is that anomalies are going to show up as outliers, right? I think it's important to make a distinction between those two things. We say in our group that an anomaly is an instance that is generated by a different generative process than the process that generated the nominal data. And we talk about nominal to avoid using the word normal because of the confusion over the Gaussian. So there's some process that's generating our anomalies. Now, those anomalies may or may not show up as outliers, right? That will depend on how good our features are. But the only practical strategy we have for finding anomalies is to assume we have good features and that the anomalies will show up as outliers. And of course, this requires having a good distance metric. So most of the implementation effort here goes into improving the distance metric. An example of this, which may surprise some of you, is to think about the isolation forest algorithm as an example of this. So the isolation forest grows randomized trees, basically binary space partitioning trees, by choosing first an attribute x.j at random from the available attributes, and then chooses a threshold uniformly at random within the observed range of attribute j, and then splits the data according to that threshold, and then does the same thing repeatedly, recursively, until every data point lives in is isolated from all the other data in its own leaf. And the statistic that we're interested in is the isolation depth, the number of random splits that it took to separate xi from all of the other data. And the intuition is that if xi is an outlier, then I sort of think of it as throwing darts, except my darts are these axis-aligned thresholds, and I'm throwing these darts at the data at random. And if a data point is an outlier, the chances of separating it, throwing these random separators, it will be separated relatively quickly. But if a data point is deeply embedded in a tight cluster in the data set, we're going to have to throw an awful lot of random darts at it to separate it from all of its neighbors. So that's the intuition. What's interesting about this, so of course, any one tree isn't very good. So we build an ensemble of them, say 50 or 100 or 1,000, and we compute the mean isolation depth. And then Liu, Ting, and Zhou have a way of turning that into an anomaly score that's scaled nicely. And there was a paper at ICML 2016 by Guha et al., where they showed that this approximates the L1 distance from the query to the data, which is maybe not surprising when you think about the fact that we're making these axis parallel splits. Okay, well, the second approach, and I should say, the isolation forest is probably the most widely applied method, sort of off the shelf for featureized data. So the second approach is density estimation, and I think for those of us who come with a statistics background, this is the first thing that occurs to us is, well, an anomaly should be something that is surprising, unusual. So let's think about that in terms of the surprisal from information theory, fit a probability density to the data points, and then flag everything that has low density as an anomaly. And so we use minus log of the probability. Now, of course, in information theory, this should actually be a probability of an event, not a probability density, but we use the densities anyway as an approximation. And I think it's worth asking, well, why density estimation as opposed to just using distance? And my answer is that that when we're measuring density at a point, basically all of the other data points are contributing to a greater or lesser extent to the density estimate at a point. So it's a more global summary of the evidence than just the distance to the nearest neighbors. An example of a density estimation method that is practical and scales to high dimension is LODA, the lightweight online detector of anomalies by Pevney. And what he does is form random, sparse, one-dimensional projections of the data. So he generates sparse projection matrices and projects the data down to 1D and then fits a density estimator in one dimension. And then we can project the data down onto that density estimator and get anomaly density scores for them. Again, minus log P scores for them. But of course, any one random projection is only seeing a small view of the data. So again, we take an ensemble approach and train 50 or 100 or 1,000 of these and take the average of these surprises. The third approach is Quantile Method. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with Vladimir Vapnik's principle that we should never solve a more difficult problem on our way to solving the problem of interest. And so according to that principle, we would argue that if we're going to set a probability density threshold and classify everything below that threshold as being anomalous, why don't we just try to model that density level set, which will be a decision boundary. This is the level set for a density of 0.005 in my fit here, and just do that. And so that's what the one-class support vector machines and support vector data description do. They're kernel methods, so they form this boundary either as a linear boundary or as a spherical boundary in the kernel space. Of course, an issue here is that we have to choose the density threshold that we're going to use at learning time rather than at runtime. And so we have less flexibility and we need to basically refit if we're going to make a substantial change in epsilon. And then the fourth approach is really of a different kind, I think, and that is so-called reconstruction methods. The idea is to fit two models, an encoder that takes X into some lower dimensional latent space typically, and then a decoder that blows it back up into the original space with the goal, this is a self-supervised method of trying to minimize the difference between X and X hat during training. So we train the weights of the E and the D components to do this. And this predates deep networks, although we think of this as a neural network kind of picture, but probably the linear version of autoencoders is just principal component analysis, right? The idea is that we have a matrix that is if the input dimension is D and the latent dimension L, then we have a D by L matrix. And what we want to do is we take W transpose times Xi, and that projects Xi down into this L dimensional latent space. And then multiplying by W unprojects it back up into the original space. And our reconstruction error then is the squared Gaussian the squared Euclidean distance between these two. And of course, this can be solved, as with most linear problems, the singular value decomposition is your friend and gives you an efficient and reasonably well-conditioned way of solving these problems. It can also be viewed as fitting a multivariate Gaussian to the data and then keeping only the L dimensions with the highest variance. So we've used PCA. Actually, I collaborated with Kiri Wagstaff, who is leading a project at JPL on the Mars Science Laboratory ChemCam instrument. This takes spectra of rocks by blasting them with a laser, and then from 7 meters away, and then the goal was to show these spectra to a geologist and to show the geologist interesting spectra. And so the idea was that we would take some initial data, fit PCA to it, and then show the expert the point that had the highest reconstruction error as being in some sense the most interesting. And if the expert, if she labeled it as uninteresting, then we would train the PCA on it. If she said, oh, that is interesting, then we would not train on it. So it was a kind of active learning strategy. And our figure of merit was how many queries did we have to present to the expert before we found a compound of interest. In this case, this was rediscovering magnesite using our technique. And it didn't take very many principal components to do well. In fact, using just 2 principal components gave us the fewest number of queries required. There are reasons why you'd want to use more, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, so my student Andrew Emmett did a benchmarking study for his master's degree, comparing the first 3 of these 4 approaches: distance-based, density-based, and quantile-based methods. And what we did was we drew data sets from the UC Irvine repository of machine learning data sets. We set it up as a open set problem. So we chose 1 or more of the classes to be the novelties or the anomalies, and the rest were our nominals. But then we also tried to manipulate 4 problem aspects that we thought might be important for these algorithms. One is how common are the anomalies? Another is how difficult are the anomalies? How deeply embedded, or how much are they outliers? We added irrelevant features to see how well the algorithms could cope with that. And we tried to either select points, anomalies that were tightly clustered, or anomalies that were widely scattered. And then Andrew generated 20 replicates of each configuration. Then we removed particular replicates that were impossible to solve, and that left us with about 12,000 non-trivial benchmarks. Okay, and so then we did a linear analysis of variance. So of course you can treat the AUC as a probability, right? It's the probability that a randomly chosen anomaly and a randomly chosen nominal will be correctly ranked by the learned anomaly score. And so if we take the log odds of the AUC, we can set this up like a logistic regression, right? And do an analysis of variance, where we're mostly interested in which algorithms perform best. But we want to do that while controlling, in quotes, for these other factors of problem difficulty, the parent data set, which we could think of as the domain, and the 4 other things that we varied. And so this is the sort of effect due to the AUC based on his study. And what we found was that the k-nearest neighbor method was actually the best performer in this. The isolation forest was second best. Then we have a couple of density estimation methods, another distance-based method, and then finally the quantile methods were the worst performers. And we think that is because they, AUC is basically a measure of ranking, and but the quantile methods are basically just learning a decision boundary, and the score that you get out of that does not work well as a ranking score. Okay, so it was actually based on the results from this that I started really promoting the isolation forest for featureized data. And some of you may know that I'm involved I'm chief scientist of a startup called Big ML. And the isolation forest algorithm is what we offer there. I know SAP offers a variation of it in their package as well. And we're finding with a lot of industrial clients that anomaly detection is actually more important to them than classification in many applications. Okay, so that's the situation for standard anomaly detection. What happens when we go to deep learning? Well, just to fix terminology, let's imagine that this is a sort of standard convolutional neural network classifier. So we're going to take our input image, which I'll call X. We'll run it through some number of layers, and we'll get to a penultimate layer, which we'll call Z, and think of as a vector of features that have been learned that are extracted from the input. And then that's going to go through a linear layer that is fully connected to calculate, in this case, 10 logits. So we'll talk about the logit LK is the unnormalized score for whether X belongs to class K. And that is basically just a dot product between a weight vector that is learned, WK, and this Z value, this latent parameter value. And then we convert those logits into probabilities by using the softmax, also known as the multinomial logistic regression likelihood function. So that's the terminology. Now, people have tried using distance-based methods for anomaly detection with deep learning, but you won't find many papers about it because it doesn't work well. And that's been our experience also. People have spent more time on density estimation methods. And so you can, of course, there's been a lot of excitement about deep density estimation with these flow models and things like MADE and GLOW and so on. And these seek, well, if you apply them to the raw images, they seek to model P of X, the probability density in the image space. But these have not worked well. And there is a provocative paper, I would say, by Lan and Din that show that representation is really critical for density estimation. And the way they show it, I don't really have time to go through it here, but my interpretation of their results is that they would say that while these fitted models are very good for doing things like sampling from a fitted density, they are not good for anomaly detection because they're really not modeling the density in the space that we're interested in. The image space lacks an appropriate neighborhood structure or distance. We don't think that distance in pixel space is really capturing the semantics of our images. So people have had more success by fitting a classifier and then estimating a density over the latent space, or jointly fitting a classifier and a density estimator. So let me first talk about open hybrid, because this is one of the, I'd say, best methods that's available right now. So the idea is that we have our training images, and this is our encoder, right, that produces that Z vector. And then they attach sort of two heads to that. One is the standard classification head that's going to use softmax for training, cross entropy for training. And the other is a flow-based model. They use residual flow deep density estimator, this thing here, that's estimating log of P of X, or maybe log P of Z, really, because the densities are really over the latent space, as they should be. And then at test time, of course, they set things up that a test image comes in and you assess first its anomaly score, which is going to be minus log P of the query. And then you threshold it to decide whether this is a novel class or a known class. And they've gotten some good results. They compared against just using the maximum softmax probability, which is what Dan Hendricks put forth as a sort of baseline anomaly score. So the idea of the maximum of the predicted softmax probabilities, right, is that if the classifier is not confident about even its highest scoring class, then maybe this is an anomaly or a novelty. And so to turn that into a score that gets bigger as you become more uncertain, we take 1 minus that. Whereas open hybrid is using this negative log P, and you can see that these are AUC values, and they were doing an open category setup that they got substantial improvements in AUC. And they did this on some bigger problems as well. Okay, the third approach was by Lucas Ruff, and that's deep quantile method. So for his PhD thesis, he developed deep support vector data description. And the idea, right, is that our encoder, which he calls phi, will take data from the input space and map it into the Z space. And in that Z space, we now want to find a hypersphere that contains 1 minus epsilon of the data. But this method is somewhat tricky to work with. If you just set up strictly that problem, what it will do is map all of the training data to the origin. And then you can find a very small radius 0 hypersphere that contains all the data. So he has to, what he does is he sets the center of this hypersphere to be the mean of a sample of the points passed through the completely untrained network to kind of anchor the sphere. and removes all bias weights from the network. And these help prevent what he calls hypersphere collapse. But I would say this method has not been very popular, I think, because it's fussy to work with in this way. And the fourth approach is reconstruction methods. And these have had some success in shallow neural networks. In fact, the first application I know of was by Dean Pomerleau. Back in 1992, he was a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University working on the NAV lab, which was a big van that held a couple of Sun workstations, if I remember correctly. And their goal was basically just lane keeping. So it was, they would drive it around on the CMU campus and collect both a forward-looking camera image, a 30 by 32 pixel image, and the steering angle that was applied by the driver. And they set this up as a supervised learning problem to, so this would be behavioral cloning, we might call it, or imitation learning strategy. And so this network had 4 hidden units and then 30 output units. And the output units were encoding the steering angle as a kind of classification problem. But in addition, he set up a reconstruction task. From the same 4 hidden units, could it reconstruct the input image? And he used the Euclidean distance between these two, the original image and the reconstructed image, as a confidence parameter. If that distance got large, then he would not trust the outputs of these output units. And the argument was, well, they're using exactly the same 4 hidden units to do both things. If they're not competent to reconstruct the image, then they're also probably not competent to do the task. And so I think this is interesting because it's a different principle. So far, basically, distances, densities, and density quantiles are all fundamentally related to trying to find outliers or surprises. But in this case, we're trying to create a task for which the trained network will fail on anomalies, but succeed on novelties. So it's anomaly detection through failure. I mean, you could even argue that that reconstruction methods are in some sense also distance-based, because the assumption of PCA and of autoencoders is that the data lie in some subspace, right? Some submanifold out of the entire image space. And outliers will be either they will be, or novel images will either be out of manifold, or they will be outliers in manifold. And so maybe there is only one principle, but I think it's useful to conceive of it, and maybe other people will come up with other tasks where the learned system will fail. And there has been some interest in auxiliary tasks as a technique. I'm thinking of things like other self-supervised tasks like rotations. Okay, well, deep autoencoders have not been worked well for anomaly detection. And part of the problem seems to be that deep autoencoders often learn to be general image compression algorithms. And so given novel images, they are succeeding compressing them and reconstructing them. And so they don't fail on the novel images. People have tried restricting the latent space to be a very tight bottleneck. My student Rishit Garapalli had some success by limiting the expressive power of the decoder that needs to do the reconstruction part. And the idea is to hope to get the decoder to sort of overfit to the training data so that it doesn't do well on novel objects. Okay, well, now let's come to the third part of the talk, which is anomaly detection based on supervised classifier logit scores. So there's a really interesting paper that just came out, that's actually 2021, because it was put onto arXiv in October of this year, or last year, by Vase, Hahn, Vidali, and Zisserman, entitled Open Set Recognition, a good classifier is all you need. So this is, something like season 2, episode 1 of the All You Need TV show. But what they argue is that if you take a carefully trained classifier, by using the latest tricks, which are things like cosine learning rate schedules, learning rate warm-up, rand augmentations, and label smoothing, and then you use the maximum of the logits as your anomaly score, then you get an anomaly detector that is competitive with the state of the art. And so they did this experiment here. So they add a plus to a method if they are using these techniques. And so these are 5 data sets that were assembled actually by Lawrence Neal, who is a student in our program who graduated a couple of years ago. And the results for just training a classifier with basic cross entropy look like this in terms of the AUROC for open set detection. And then they compared against 4 other methods here. There may have been a couple of others in the paper. One is open hybrid, which I had described. Another one is something called adversarial reciprocal points, which I don't have time to explain. But it is quite a good performer, and maybe it's maybe slightly better than the technique here. In any case, this is the gray line is ARPL with their ARPL does involve training a GAN to synthesize artificial anomalies and then train against those as well. And it just has a clever way of doing that. So you can see that it's performing well. And then here's cross entropy with these improvements. And now it's really competitive with these, and also ARPL-CS with these improvements, which improves it slightly. They also compared to some larger problems, the Cub birds, aircraft data set, and ImageNet, training on 1,000 classes and then testing on having 1,000 novel classes as well. And they divided these up sort of by their semantic difficulty. And here they were not able to train ARPL with the GAN because these problems are, the images are quite large. And so the GAN training is a lot more challenging. But they found again that they were able with cross entropy to beat ARPL on these, except on the ImageNet cases. Okay, so why is a well-trained classifier giving us good novelty scores? It doesn't seem to correspond to any of the principles we've talked about. It's not based on distances. It's not based on task failure. Well, so what's going on? Well, I would like to answer that by saying, well, how are open set images being represented in this Z space? And so here's a visualization that was done by my student Alex, where he trained a dense net on CFAR 10. So these are 10 object classes, treating 6 of them as known and 4 of them as novel. And the 6 known classes or instances from them are going to be represented by darker green colors in this plot. And the novel classes will all be shown as light green. And so we captured the Z activation vectors throughout all of training over the many epochs. I can't remember how many. And then pooled them all and did a big UMAP visualization so that they would all be in the same coordinate system in a 2-dimensional projection. So this is where the training image or the validation images are projected before any training happens. They're mostly on top of each other in a relatively small number of locations in the space. And now I'm going to be stepping through roughly 10 epochs at a time. And you can see that what's happening is the data points that belong to the known categories are kind of being pulled out of the center of the space away from the middle. And of course, remember that the learning algorithm isn't seeing these light green points. It's only seeing the darker green points. And so as we train, things are pulled out and then coalesce into tight clusters. This coalescing phenomenon actually may be a bit of an artifact of the way UMAP works, because I doubt that it forms bubbles like this in the space. I think that's a UMAP artifact. But in any case, when we're done, the 6 known classes are formed up into pretty tight clusters. And not surprisingly, a linear support vector machine can separate them. Linear logistic regression can separate them very well. But the novel points are basically still in the center of the space. Some of them have been pulled away along with the known classes, and some of them even are outliers that we might be able to detect using distance techniques. But mostly they are inliers, kind of in the middle of the space where open space has been created because the known classes have been pulled out of the center of the space. And we're not the only people to have observed this. So there was a paper by Tack et al. Called CSI, which was using SimClear, a kind of approach to train using purely self-supervised learning, so no class labels. And they were doing, the known classes were coming from CFAR 10, and the out of distribution images were from CFAR 100. And those are the red points, are the out of distribution points. And so they found that the out of distribution points tended to be more in the center of the space, to have smaller, the activation vectors had smaller, norm than the data that was reflected the in-domain data. And Vase et al. Show what they didn't say which projection method they used. I suspect this is PCA, but again, they find that the novel points, which are in black here, are in the middle of the space, and the known classes have been pulled out. So I think what's going on is what I call the familiarity hypothesis. And basically, it derives from the fact that the only way these networks have of representing a novel image is in terms of the features that they learned for describing the known classes, the known data. And so the familiarity hypothesis is that our networks are not detecting novelty so much as detecting the absence of familiarity. So this is, now I'm going to tell you a story because I don't have experiments yet to back it up. But suppose that we had never seen an elephant before, or that our neural network had never seen an elephant before, and it sees one. I would argue that it probably doesn't have feature detectors for recognizing tusks or trunks. It might have feature detectors for recognizing feet if it's maybe trained on hippopotamuses or rhinoceroses or something. And it might recognize eyes. In fact, the head kind of looks a bit like an octopus head to me. But the idea is that when it would see this, it would say, well, I don't recognize very much here. Only a few of my feature detectors are triggered. And so my logit score is going to be lower because my logit score is basically putting a positive weight on some set of features for, say, my logit score for some known class. So for hippopotamus, it's going to say, well, I don't see hippo ears. I don't see the hippo mouth. All I see is hippo feet. And so that will have a low activation. And the same for the other classes, right? And so the thought is that it's not detecting the novel aspects of what makes an elephant novel. It's just not seeing enough familiar things to recognize it as belonging to any of the known classes. So it's kind of disappointing because, as my colleague Alan Fern says, if we had an alien who was holding a dog, we would see the dog, but not the alien. So what's some evidence for this? Well, there's some initial evidence that the max logit is better than the max softmax probability or the norm of the latent vector. And this is from Vase et al. They're plotting the AUC on this axis as a function of the number of training epochs. And this is the AUC for the max logit score. And we had found that max logit was also the best score in our experiments. Another piece of evidence from Alex is that we looked at setting a threshold on the activations in the Z vector, and then counting up the number of activations that are greater than that threshold. So if we set the threshold at 1, for example, in-domain images from known classes turn on about 10 of the features. That is to say, 10 features have an activation level bigger than 1, but only but out of domain or novel class data only turns on about 6 features. And so the fact that this gold curve is generally below the blue curve says that, wherever you set this threshold, you're seeing fewer features turned on by novel class objects than by known class objects. A third piece of evidence comes from a recent paper by Sun and Lee. They looked at just focusing on what they call the contributions. And we had actually been doing the same thing in our group. So again, if we think about the logit vector as the dot product between a weight vector and the z's, we can think of the contribution of feature j as just the weight from the logit vector times feature j. So we'll call that CJK. And so we could sort them into ascending order. And this is a plot from Sun Lee, where the darker blue is the mean and the spread around this is the variance. And so what we see is that there are quite a few features that are making positive contributions to a particular class. And there are some features that are making negative contributions. So now these features are presumably ones that are actually on the object, or that are, or if they're not, they're background features that are correlated with class membership, right? This is positive evidence in favor of the class. And these are negative contributions. These are presumably features that are stronger for some other class, and we're trying to discriminate away from them. So now if we think about novelty detection or as our goal, then we really don't care about these negative contributions, because if something is a new class, we don't expect it to turn on very many of these at all. And in particular, we're more interested in that there will be fewer of these features turned on. And so it would be interesting to test an algorithm, and we're doing this experiment right now, where we only focus on the positive contributions. So we could define a new anomaly score, which is the sum of the positive contributions of the latent space. And the claim would be that this would be an even better anomaly detector than the max logit. Well, it turns out Sun and Lee did almost this experiment. In their paper, they introduced a method called DICE. Their paper is called On the Effectiveness of Sparsification for Detecting Deep Unknowns, where they choose the top 10% most positive contributions as their novelty score. And they compared against a bunch of different things, including the maximum softmax probability, the Mahalanobis distance classifier. And they found that this made a big improvement in AUROC. And so now I can't remember what their in-domain data set was, but if we look at this energy thing, this energy is the log of the denominator of the softmax. And so, you know, if we sort of squint, it's basically the log of the x with the softmax. And so it's, so I think the energy would be very closely related to the max softmax probability. And so there's clearly an improvement by just looking at this DICE, what they call the DICE score. All right, so I guess the last thing I want to do is ask, well, is this how computer vision has to be? Can we actually expect computer vision systems to perceive things that they haven't been trained on? After all, a deep learning system must represent its novel objects using the features that it learned on the known objects. And some of you may be reminded of this old experiment that Blakemore and Cooper did, where they raised kittens for 6 weeks in a completely constrained environment, where the kittens were in a world where there were only vertical lines. The floor of this cage was clear, and so they see vertical lines above and below them, and they even wear a collar so they can't see themselves. And then there were other kittens that were raised in a horizontal environment. And what they found then was that after 6 weeks, kittens that had been raised in an environment with only horizontal or only vertical lines, they were virtually blind to contours perpendicular to the orientation that they had experienced. They say in the paper, if you took a vertical kitten and a horizontal kitten and sat them side by side, and then you took a pencil or something and held it vertically and moved it around, the vertical kitten would play with it and pay attention to it. But the horizontal kitten would act as if it didn't see anything. And then if you turn the pen on its side so that it's now horizontal, now it's the horizontal kitten that would play with it, and the vertical kitten would completely ignore it. So this is what our computer vision systems are doing right now. Obviously, they have more variability than just vertical lines. But is this, are we stuck with this? And maybe there are some possible paths forward. Maybe, I mean, obviously, the first thing we should do is train on as many object categories as possible, because this will give us a much richer vocabulary for representing novel things. But I wonder if we could also systematically synthesize using computer graphics techniques. Could we synthesize all kinds of things that might be interesting? Could we, if we had never seen tusks or trunks before, could we just playing around with shapes synthesize all kinds of bizarre natural shapes and train our networks to recognize them as well? And my third thought for going forward is So evidently, when our networks are looking at, this elephant, for example, and they're not seeing the tusk and the trunk, could they detect, basically using some maybe entropy measure or something, that there's interesting content in the image there, but they know they don't have features to encode it. So maybe there are some lower level cues that would tell us that there's something interesting in the image that's novel, even though when we get to the Z level, we don't have features that represent it. Okay, well, I'm slightly over time, so let me wrap up. I first reviewed the sort of classic anomaly detection methods: distances, densities, density quantiles, and reconstruction. And then we moved to computer vision, and we saw that while people have pursued those, the surprise is that a well-trained classifier is working as well as these deep anomaly detection methods. And I'm advocating for this familiarity hypothesis as a way of explaining that phenomenon, and it suggests improvements that may give us better methods. But I am worried that if we rely only on the absence of familiarity, our systems will be blind to all kinds of novelty in the world. So I will stop there. The slides are available, and I have lots of bibliography too. So let me stop and answer questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Dietterich, for that wonderful talk. I'll just clap on behalf of everyone. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand via the Zoom feature, and I'll call on you, and then you can go ahead and ask.
Okay, well, the first thing here in the chat looks really interesting. So I have not seen this paper. So thank you very much for pointing us at this. This is great.
Yeah. I guess there's a chat by or a question by Adi, and the maybe.
Would deep autoencoders work for featureized data? I don't have any experience. Again, we have to figure out how to make sure that the deep autoencoder fails for novel data. So somehow we have to constrain the expressive power of the deep autoencoder. And I think that in general, it makes them kind of hard to work with because you have to do a lot of lots of runs. Maybe someone could come up with a way of auto-tuning the deep autoencoder to make sure that it doesn't turn into a general purpose compression technique. But yeah, I don't know. We've had a lot of success with just using PCA with featureized data. Okay. I don't know where the slides are on the. Maybe the organizers can give us. Yeah, they should be on the website for the seminar.
Yep, they're already there. Yep.
Oh, great.
Hi. Can I directly ask a question now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I'm very impressed and also convinced by this familiarity hypothesis. But so my question is, we might be able to synthesize some images or yes, to train as many objects as possible to overcome this. But like I also noticed, there are a lot of works that try to, like, for example, use human priors or like compositionality, etc., to like or like post hoc manipulation, like different ways to like inject like human knowledge into the model to overcome this or to make it more generalizable. What do you think of like this approach?
Well, I mean, I think if we, the kinds of networks that I was describing here are kind of primitive if we think about them from the point of view of computer vision, right? Because we're not even detecting and segmenting out the object of interest, and we're not understanding the whole scene. And I think to the extent that we can do those things and understand the scene, understand the hierarchical structure of objects in terms of parts and so on, then we should be able to do much better. So, but we may still have a challenge, right? That again, we only will have representations for the things that we know, either the things humans know or that the system has learned from training data.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there is some fundamental limit there, and it would be nice to come up with strategies. I mean, one advantage of things like reconstruction as a task is that that should work for everything. You know, if we can't reconstruct the image in our representation, then somehow there's something happening there that we haven't seen, and we could flag it as novel. So I would love to see reconstruction methods succeed. I just can't make them work myself.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
And I see Kiri Wagstaff is here and Sharon Lee. So yeah, thank you for your great work, which I really enjoyed reading about.
Anya,
Anya
has a question.
So yeah, I kind of wanted to ask. Maybe it's not a question of such a deep level as they were asked before, but we're talking about about networks that don't detect novelty, but more detect absence of similarity. And there was a slide with visualization using UMAP. And I was just wondering, how was the visualization held through, right? Because I'm wondering, was it UMAP was just applied to data, or was it what was the idea there, right? Because I kind of I worked with UMAP a bit, so I was wondering what was the idea?
Okay, so the idea was for each of our images, right? We get I think a 384 dimensional latent vector, and we wanted to visualize that in 2-dimensional space.
Oh, yeah,
so we used UMAP to map down to 2-dimensional space. But we wanted to do it in a way that we could observe the dynamics of the training process, right? So we collected these activation vectors after each epoch of the training. So each passed through the training data. And so I think if we train for 100 epochs, we would have now for each data point 100 vectors that represented it. But we took all of those vectors together, or actually probably a sample of them, because although UMAP scales better than t-SNE, it still, and then ran UMAP and obtained then a 2-dimensional projection that puts all of those epochs in the same coordinate system, so that we're hoping that the way those points move around is telling us something about the dynamics. But of course, it is very tricky to interpret.
Perfectly. I was just wondering what exactly was visualized, right? So you already told me that those were the vectors after each training. So I was just wondering about that. Thank you so much. And thank you so much on the wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it so much. I was looking at the screen all the time, and I didn't, my attention was fully on, and I really enjoyed the classification that you did, right? Because I was also reading a study by, I think, Pimentel, and he was doing a bit of different classification, but I also really enjoyed yours. Thank you so much. It was super interesting.
Okay, I see Sharon has her hand up.
Yes, thank you, Tom, for this excellent talk. I was quite intrigued by this familiarity hypothesis that you put forward towards the end of the talk. I guess I'm wondering if whether this notion of, say, contribution, right, that we put forward in the DICE paper is close to this, how you define this familiarity, or
right, yes, yeah, that's
missing,
right,
or whether something is still missing in the current definition of contribution that can better capture this notion of familiarity. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this.
No, I think that that computing the contributions is exactly the right thing to do, and we were doing that in my group. And then when you sent me the link to your paper and I read it just last week, I said, "Whoa, yeah, this is exactly the right thing." And because I hadn't thought about the negative contributions until then, and the idea that maybe removing those, because if there are features relevant to other classes in the image, that's not important for detecting a novel object. Of course, maybe most of those activations are small for novel objects anyway, because we don't have features from any of the classes visible. But your results suggest that it's really useful to filter out those. I guess one other question is, maybe we should be selecting features based on a signal to noise ratio instead of just their mean activations. And of course that relates to your other paper at NeurIPS, noticing that some features have very high variance when we present a novel class image. And so, yeah, so maybe there's something to do. I think there are maybe more things to try there. Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you, Tom, for sharing the work with the audience, by the way. I definitely think, looking into this activation space and the feature representation space in general is definitely going to give us more clue on how to better derive these anomaly score or OOD score. So thank you for that, sharing that insight.
Yeah, I think as a community, and certainly speaking just for myself, I came to deep novelty detection or anomaly detection with this preconceived notion that we would be measuring distances or surprisals or something, and not thinking about it as from a computer vision standpoint. And I think what you've been doing, Sharon, and others, really thinking about what's going on from a computer vision standpoint is what's really showing us the directions we need to move in. So we need to stop thinking of it as a statistics problem and think of it as a perception problem.
Yeah, I agree. I think we need all those complementary perspectives. Thank you, Tom.
I'm sorry, may I echo on this? I think I have a technical question on the logic-based score, because I know the training objective is still a cross entropy. So there is a translation invariance between the logics and the cross entropy. So I think there's extra degrees of freedom. So how can you handle that extra degree from in logics?
Well, since the logit is just unnormalized, I think it's more sensitive to the scores. I mean, at least according to my hypothesis, we're really interested in the total activation, total positive activation of the features that have been learned. And if we normalize them, we lose that total score. Now, there's quite a lot of evidence that using label smoothing can really help in terms of for instance, the Mahalanobis technique, which fits I realize I meant to have a slide in there on the Mahalanobis technique, but you fit basically a multivariate Gaussian to the activation vectors in each class. And that's a density estimation strategy. But the combination of label smoothing tends to cause the clusters to be much tighter in the latent space, and so the Mahalanobis technique should work much better there. It could be that the techniques that Sharon has developed also will work much better if we do label smoothing. Label smoothing avoids, I guess, learning really high, trying to get really high activations in the latent space. I don't know. I mean, it could help, it could hurt. It's hard to predict offhand, but right, if you're training to hit 0-1 hard targets, then there's this nice paper from Jeff Hinton's group showing that you only that's going to drive the logit weights off toward infinity.
Yes.
Either plus infinity or minus infinity, and that means these contribution scores will also head off toward positive and negative infinity, and maybe their variances will too, which would be a problem. So it might be better to use soft targets, a smooth label smoothing, because then we know that the optimal weights, that there's a limit on how big they can become, and so maybe that would be better.
Yes, I think generally the logics are more brittle than the maximum some max probabilities.
Well, it is a maximum likelihood estimator, so it has all those weaknesses, right?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe.
I think there was Highway has one more question. I think.
Yeah. I just decided to unmute myself and put in a few more words. So first, so for Tally's question, I've also done a similar experiments on this, like comparing softmax probability to logits. So my impression is that for novel objects, just like what we've said about this familiarity hypothesis for novel images, you will get in general lower like lodges on every dimension. And so because of this translation invariance, when you like do this into softmax probability, you might even get a very high softmax probability because of this. Because every lodge is small, doesn't mean that there's not a larger, like largest one, and the largest one might be actually large, relatively large. So that's the problem of this. But if you like do it in the largest space, it will like it won't have this problem. So that's my like explanation for this. So I have another question. So yes, like digging into this activation space of features, it is good, and I've also been doing this for quite a while. But yes, like today, I'm thinking that yes, this might just be like we are always using this like familiarity hypothesis. We are only using the like the patches, the parts that we have been seeing, and that might be problematic. But like what Tom you have suggested is that generative like reconstructive methods might overcome this problem. But I don't understand this quite well. So can you explain it a little bit more?
Well, I guess yeah, I'm now questioning my own answer. Okay, but I'll give it anyway. So my intuition is that reconstruction. The goal is to create this reconstruction task that the network will not be able to do for novel images. So we're going to detect novelty by failure to achieve this task, and we can see that the geom method, right, that had the self-supervised task of predicting which rotation had been applied to the image. That's also a failure approach, right? If you this all goes back to Dean Pomerleau's thing. If the same hidden units that are doing the classification can't solve the rotation task, then maybe they shouldn't be trusted. So my thought is that we can measure failure using just the features from the training data. So we don't have to imagine what these novelties would look like. Whereas but I guess maybe your question is this fundamentally different from just looking at how much the logits have dropped? Because in some sense, that's also a measure of failure. It's a failure of our learned representation to have a very rich understanding of what this novel object is. I think one thing that's really interesting about the logits, because if you try to use just the distances between the z vectors, what will happen when you have a novel object that is really can be well represented by the learned features? So it is somehow a novel combination of known features. An example might be maybe a Segway, right, which is a sort of combination of features you might find on a motorbike and features you would find on a bicycle. So probably you don't have to learn any new features to learn a Segway. And this is an example due to Russ Salakudinov. So if you looked at the norm of the latent vector or its distances, the norm might be quite large. But when we look at it through the contribution vector, sort of sitting on each logit and looking at the activations, we only care about the activations relevant to each of our known classes, and all of those will probably be small. And so I think that one thing that is kind of nice about the max logit score is that that even if the novel object is a novel combination of known features, we will still probably score it as novel when we use the max logit score. So, whereas I think a distance-based metric like might not do that. It might succeed or it might not succeed, but it would depend a lot on whether we had captured the covariance structure of the correlation structure of the features. Yeah. Okay, well, these are great questions and a really fun conversation. And thank you for the pointers. The literature is so vast. I'm always sure that I'm missing something important, and so this is good.
Yes, I guess we should wrap up there. Thank you very much again, Professor Dietterich, for giving this talk.
Okay.
And
Nice
everyone.
to see you, Ayun.
Yeah. Sorry, maybe more sentences that our next talk is given by Sharon, who is here also, and it's the scheduled in December, in February. So hopefully we will see each other again soon. And let's thank the speaker again. And goodbye, everyone.